So as some of you know, and as I mentioned at the beginning of our service, 2 weeks ago for Shabbat, I was in Israel for the annual convention of Reform Rabbis of North America and actually around the world. We gathered from North America, from Israel, and from Europe. We were 400 in total rabbis. It was a powerful and fascinating trip for our week in Israel, far too short. We met with Prime Minister Netanyahu. We met with nearly 24 leaders of the Israeli Knesset. We heard from scholars. We toured and experienced new Israeli centers of learning and technology. I went to Google in Israel. And we met with leaders and activists on all sides of the religious and the political discourse that overlays and underlays, I should say, everything that happens in modern Israel today. And of course, we explored ancient archaeological sites and delved deeply into biblical and rabbinic texts with wonderful scholars and educators. It was a historic trip because for the first time we worshiped together and read Torah together at the new egalitarian section of the Kotel of the Western Wall. All 400 Reform rabbis, male and female and transgender, a moment that made not only history but also headlines as the religious parties in Israel grappled with the reality of a vibrant Reform progressive Judaism that is ascending in their midst, and in spite of their attempts to defame or derail our leaders and our congregations in Israel. We were front page news in Israel. There was a photo of my friend Rabbi Zach Shapiro and our colleague in Israel, Kinneret Shirion, leading and reading from Torah in front of the Kotel. And it was front page news in Israel and all across the world. Though what we were doing, men and women reading Torah together, was really only newsworthy or controversial in Israel. We've been doing it here for a long time. In the midst of all of this, I had a very unique experience, a very Israeli experience. I was invited to Shabbat dinner at a good friend's home. And so I had a typical Israeli Shabbat dinner, which, as I'm going to share with you, that too should have made headlines. One of my best friends from my days as a camp counselor with BBYO, B'nai B'rith Youth Organization back east, is Gil Hadash and his wife Dondi. Gil is the principal of a progressive K-12 school in Modi'in. Modi'in is a suburb of both Jerusalem and Tel Aviv because it sits right in the middle. It's a planned community designed by Moshe Safdie, and it can take a train either way. And it's a growing community of 85,000 that they expect will be 250,000 in the next 10 years. His wife, Dondi, is an art therapist who works in the same school system. And 2 days before I arrived in Israel, I was posting something on Facebook, and Gil and Dondi messaged me that say that they were back from their 6-month sabbatical where they had been traveling through Southeast Asia, and was I actually ba'aretz? Was I actually in the country? And yes, I was, and so we connected. Thank goodness for Facebook. Gil and Dondi are those kinds of people, those kinds of Jews who take this hard-earned sabbatical that he had received, this time away, and they go to some impoverished part and corner of the world and build schools and water systems and community centers. And they bring their 2 young children along with them to do it. They do tikkun olam. This was their shlichut, this was their religious mission, though they would be the first to tell you that they are secular Jews, and there was nothing religious about what they did. Which raises the first of many questions I asked around the Shabbat dinner table, which is, why did you go? And why did you go there? So I was invited to Gil's parents' home for Shabbat dinner with his whole family. This was the first time that they had seen Gil and Dondi and their children for 6 months. Gil has 3 siblings. They are all married. They all have their own children, so it was a packed house. In so many ways, the evening was like any other heartwarming family reunion. There were hugs and kisses and backslaps and jokes and pictures and stories and lots of catching up. It was just all in Hebrew. We sat down at the Shabbat dinner table. I noticed I was wearing the only yarmulke in the room. Chana, Gil's mom, was self-conscious. I was the first rabbi they had ever had in their home. It was a first in the history of the family. Hannah lit 2 candles. She didn't say a blessing. Yaakov, Gil's dad, raised a plain wine glass and said, Borei Pri Hagafen. That was the extent of the blessing. And we all drank incredible Israeli wine. There was homemade challah on the table. By the way, in Israel on Friday night, you can smell challah in every apartment building. It's all over. It's unbelievable. It wasn't covered and there was no motzi, but it was delicious. And as we passed it around without motzi, everyone exchanged a greeting, as you do in Israel on Fridays, of Shabbat Shalom. You say Shabbat Shalom to the guy who sells you flowers at the Makolet, at the little bodega on the corner. You say Shabbat Shalom to the taxi driver. You say Shabbat Shalom to everybody. So out came the chicken soup with the requisite Israeli soup nuts, these little croutons that are a standard issue, a staple of every Israeli meal. And then came shrimp and red tomato sauce, chicken, potatoes, salad, another salad, Israelis like salads, brisket, and all of that was to be followed by pie and ice cream. In case you missed it, it was not a kosher meal. I managed. Everything was in Hebrew, as I said, and the conversation ranged from Gil and Dondi's travels in Vietnam to a heated debate about the headlines in the paper over why women felt that they needed to read Torah or wear a talit at the kotel at the Western Wall. I was defending the progressive women, and Gil's sister, who by her own admission had never been inside of a synagogue and sees no need to ever enter one, was defending the Orthodox rabbis who want to prohibit such rituals when performed by women. The Judaism that she doesn't practice is Orthodox Judaism. And then her older brother chimes in from the other end of the table, and he says that he and his family have been going to the old port in Tel Aviv on Friday nights to sing Shabbat songs, to welcome the Shabbos with a Reformed progressive community there that gathers there every week. There are drums and guitars and women singing verses from the Torah and from the Siddur. He says that it touches something inside of him, that it stirs a part of his identity that is both Jewish and Israeli. And Gil then answers my question from before, which is, why did you go to Vietnam to build schools and all this stuff? He says in Hebrew to me, as though I get the conjoiner here, he says, Bidiyuk. He says, exactly. I say, Bidiyuk, ma bidiyuk, what? And he says, exactly. That's why we went to Vietnam to build schools. I said, what's why? He said, it's what we do as Jews. It's what we do as Israelis. And I say, Gil, you're secular. You don't even own a yarmulke. But his brother says that's why he goes to the old port, to sing songs for Kabbalat Shabbat. It's what he does. It connects with something Jewishly. And it's in that moment that he clarifies something that we so often forget. That the two identities, Jew and Israeli, are for very many people separate and distinct from each other. That he and his brother have found a way to bridge them is significant and headline news. It was such an interesting and enlightening experience to participate in this typical Israeli family Shabbat dinner. And as we drove home, one more question lingered in my mind. As I was contemplating this Shabbat dinner without blessings but with shrimp, the defense of the orthodoxy by a secular Israeli and the embrace of progressive Judaism and Tikkun Olam by more secular Israelis, the question that wouldn't leave me was, why aren't Israelis more Jewish? Now, of course, I realize it all depends on what one means by the word Jewish. But the inescapable bottom line is that Israeli Jews are not like North American Jews. In case we need more evidence to support that observation, it's this week that the Pew Center released a study on Israeli Jewish identity. Maybe you saw it in some of the papers. It's a fascinating read. The survey was conducted in person with 5,601 Israeli adults. It revealed a very complex portrait of what it means to be Jewish in Israel today. Israeli Jews do Jewish differently than we do. They do Jewish differently from each other as well. In Israel, Judaism is tribal. There is secular or Chiloni, there is traditional, religious Zionist, and Haredi, aka black hats. Where in North America, our movements easily commingle and collaborate with each other, some in this very room belong to this synagogue, and that synagogue, and that synagogue, all at the same time up and down Oak Street, and it's just fine. In Israel, each of these four tribes is very distinct and segregated from each other. So let's focus just for a moment on secular Israeli Jews. They are involved in Jewish ritual more than their secular North American Jewish counterparts. But they don't see it as religious ritual. They see these rituals as culturally Jewish. Shabbat is an Israeli holiday, not a Jewish one, not a religious holiday. Only 2% of secular Israelis say that religion is important in their lives. 60% say they have never gone or been into a synagogue. They are more secular than secular North American Jews, but they are also so Jewish. And why is that? In part, you could blame it on Israel's founders. They were anti-religious. They were fleeing an overly passive diaspora Judaism and an overly oppressive shtetl Judaism ruled by rabbis and yeshivas. The purpose of Zionism was to build a new Jew, a tough Jew, a bronzed Jew by the sun, hardened by the toil of making the desert bloom. The new Jew of this new Israel, the secular Jew that makes up 40% of the Israeli Jewish population, doesn't need the synagogue. The land itself is one big synagogue. The land itself and mitzvahs and civil law, they are all interchangeable. Stores are closed on Shabbat. Buses don't run. Most restaurants are closed on the Shabbos. Jewish holidays are national holidays, and you have to make an effort not to keep kosher. And many, like Gil's parents, make that effort with shrimp and tomato sauce. Because Judaism is not their religion. It's their culture. It's their tribe. By contrast, North American Jews have a religion. Our culture is Canadianism or Americanism, but our religion is Judaism. And if we want to feel Jewish, we have to do Jewish. And the only Jewish doing is along that spectrum of religion that can be found up and down Oak Street, more or less. It wasn't always this way. America, too, had its period, North America, I should say, had its period of cultural but not religious Judaism. It was the old socialist leftist values that see Judaism through the lens of the prophetic imperative to repair the world. We used to call that Yiddishkeit. Now we call it Bernie Sanders Judaism. They're one and the same. There is a very old Israeli joke that reflects this Yiddishy Judaism that I think is really the origin of Israeli and North American Jewish secularism. A woman is on a bus with her grandson. She is speaking Yiddish, and a young man overhears her and turns to her and says, "Madam, this is Israel. You can speak Hebrew to him." And she replies, "Yes, but I don't want him to forget that he's Jewish." In Israel, amongst the non-Orthodox, Jewish is a cultural identity. It's not a religious one. But this is changing. It changed right before my eyes at this Shabbat table, at that Shabbat dinner. And that was what was so interesting. The Pew study found that 8% of Israeli society is Haredi, black hat Jews, ultra-Orthodox. But another study found that 7.5% of Jewish Israeli society, nearly the same percentage of Israelis, identify themselves as Reform or conservative Jews. This is good and bad. Israeli Jewish identity is becoming more religious. Secularism is slowly shrinking, but the society is becoming more polarized by religion. Just as the religious take over neighborhoods and cultural standards in civil society, Israeli cultural Judaism is slowly evolving to embrace North American progressive Jewish modes of expression. Secular Israelis are now saying Jewish tradition and texts belong to all of us, not just the black hats. Popular musicians are adapting piyutim, sacred Jewish poems. It's becoming actually a minor cultural Israeli obsession, Reform progressive Judaism. We are the flavor of the day. On Shabbat, throngs gather to celebrate at the old train station in Jerusalem, at the port in Tel Aviv. And yes, Israeli women are demanding the right to read Torah at the Kotel, a place and a right that they had no use for a generation ago. And so back to our Shabbat dinner. The conversation was a microcosm of the shifting Jewish identity of modern Israel and North American Judaism. And it is a very important conversation that needs to take place, a conversation that Reform Judaism has started. It's important because in the next generation, given Jewish demographic trends, there will be only two Jewish communities of any real significance in the world: Israel and North America. I know that our focus is often on, and perhaps singularly on, Israel's existential threats and the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Ari Shavit wrote this week, "People prefer to address the brawl with the Palestinians and the quarrel over the occupation and ignore questions of identity and issues of symbolic importance. We couldn't be making a bigger mistake," he warns us. Precisely because of the external challenges Israel faced and faces, we must find a way to manage the internal controversies intelligently and responsibly. Maybe it can begin, and maybe it will end, with Shabbat dinner. We cannot become strangers to each other. Both communities need to listen to each other, to speak to each other, to learn from each other, and to live with each other. The model for that, actually, is North American Jewish communities. And it is perhaps the greatest export and most important contribution that we can make to Israeli society. And it begins, like all things Jewish, with food. Shabbat Shalom. Our service continues, page 586. We rise for Aleinu.